As I speak to you today, our world is in a very turbulent time. We're collectively experiencing the stress and trauma of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I also believe that that pandemic has unmasked our personal and collective trauma, needing to be addressed, needing to be healed. Here in the United States, in the last few days, we've seen cities erupting in rage out of racial injustice, triggered by the brutal murder of George Floyd. But that was a trigger event, bringing hundreds of years of racial injustice and trauma to the surface. And I believe it's also bringing to light the layers of trauma that we're experiencing collectively around abuse of power, injustice, the mistreatment of others due to their color, their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, their religious beliefs. In so many ways, we are in a time where we're seeing the ways in which we can be destructive to each other, the ways in which we can see each other as different, as separate, as less than, and project our unresolved wounds, our undealt with hatred or anger onto each other in a way that's incredibly destructive. It is time to heal. I also believe, as we're in this turbulent time and this intense time of transition, it's not only revealing these unresolved wounds in the collective, but collective trauma triggers our unresolved personal trauma. The two blend, and we find ourselves dealing with our own personal unresolved wounds, trauma, pain, depression, anger, fear. It's all up. It's all coming to the surface. In coming to the surface, it can be a time where we feel overwhelmed, or we react, or we act out, or it can be a time when we heal. In order to heal, we have to face the truth of the wounds. We have to allow space for the pain to be heard and seen and held in order to move into healing and wholeness. As we're in this intense time of healing, of transformation, the wisdom of the earth and sky are guiding us. Right now, Venus is invisible. She's in the underworld. She started her underworld journey May 26th and will be in that journey until her return as a morning star on June 12th. What's interesting is that in the sky, as she's in the underworld, Venus, right next to the sun, they are in the stars of Taurus, along one of the horns of the bull, very close to the star Elnath. Elnath is a star that has traditionally been symbolic of power, of strength that can be used for destruction, or in a skilled way for diplomacy and healing. Venus in the underworld is guiding us to face those unresolved issues around power, abuse of power, and how we can come into right balance with our strength so that power is about restoration and healing and not about destruction. As we explore this, let me describe in more depth the meaning of the Venus journey and how that is described for us in our most ancient written myth, the myth of Inanna, and how significant that myth is for us in this time. The myth of Inanna was written approximately 2000 BCE, but most likely came from an oral tradition and dates back to about 3000 BCE, before the current era. The myth is a description of the 584 Venus cycle, as she is the evening star and then sinks below the horizon and disappears from view, which is where she is right now, and then reappears as a morning star, and then for 260 days is a morning star, and then disappears from view again, this time around the backside of the sun, until she emerges as an evening star again. So it's a 584-day cycle with approximately 260 days in her evening star phase, then in her morning star phase, her journey into the underworld, which is between that evening star phase and when she emerges as a morning star, is when Venus is in her inferior conjunction. It's when Venus is moving between the sun and the earth. It is that intense period where she is experiencing the light of the sun and facing the earth. It's that relationship between light and our experience here in human form on this planet. You can think of it as she's holding those polarities of immortality, mortality, light, and the darkness that we can experience and the suffering that we can experience here on the earth. She is holding that confrontation between the upper world and the lower world. In the myth, it is outlining this journey, but it's also important to know that the myth was written in another time of cultural turbulence. It was written down in the cusp of the shift from the age of Taurus into the age of Aries. This was when the nomadic cultures that were honoring the sky gods and bringing the energy of the patriarchal period were invading and destroying the goddess-honoring cultures who held that reverence for the sacred feminine and the honoring of the earth. So the myth describes in symbolic detail the turbulence that was happening culturally with this shift, the storminess, and the way in which it led to the increasing devaluation of the sacred feminine and devaluation of women and of our relationship with the earth. And as we moved into the age of Aries, there was the idealization of the sky gods, of the sacred masculine, of that sense of spirituality as what's beyond us, not in us and around us. And as we move into the age of Aries, It becomes the time of male dominance. It becomes the time of movement from honoring culture and art and the sacred feminine into an honoring of separation, of individuation, and a movement into war. It's about divisiveness. At the deeper level, the sacred masculine is about our need to explore separation and individuation, our need to have a sense of who we are as separate as well as in relationship with each other. It was the time of exploring the capacity of our minds, and particularly our left brain ways of thinking and knowing. As we move from the age of Taurus into the age of Aries, we move from right brain dominance into left brain dominance, into an emphasis on relationship, into an emphasis on separation and individuation. Every age has its gift and its shadow side. But the shadow side of the age of Aries that has really shaped our historical period across the last 4,000 to 5,000 years, the shadow side of that has been our exploration of the abuse of power and of entering into the devaluation of the sacred feminine, of women, of our relationship with Mother Earth, of our sense of balance and harmony with each other. This is the shadow side of this period of patriarchy. We are now at a cusp of a new age. We are leaving the age of Pisces and moving into the age of Aquarius. The age of Aquarius is about coming back into balance. It is about reuniting the energy of the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine. It is about remembering we are all, in our diversity, part of the unity of all that is, and remembering our relationships with each other and with the earth. Then we can bring the wisdom of the gifts of the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine back into unity, back into balance. But as we're in that turbulence between the ages, I believe it is bringing to the surface all the shadow side of these old paradigms. And again, it's critical that we not get mired in the acting out of the shadow side, but bring it to consciousness in order to heal. Again, Venus and the myth of Inanna can guide us in that. The myth of Inanna opens with there being this split, this rupture, this wound. You can think of it as Inanna has lost parts of herself that are in the underworld, but it's also the story of Inanna's separation and rupture with her sister Ereshkigal, who is now queen of the great below, of the underworld. And Inanna is queen of heaven and earth, revered by her people. So already we're seeing, with the movement into the patriarchal period, the increasing hierarchical dynamics and the sense of some are privileged and some are devalued and abused and put in these positions where they're suppressed and repressed. Ereshkigal, who once was united and at one with her sister Inanna, is now the queen of the underworld. She has been raped and banished and pushed into the underworld. So already we're seeing now this movement into the split, where some are in positions of privilege and power and others are banished and abused and mistreated and exploited. Ereshkigal also was associated with the great grain goddess. So she's also representing those energies of Mother Earth that are now being devalued and exploited and abused. Inanna, in this position of power and privilege, realizes and feels the imbalance. The imbalance in her relationship with her sister, her sense of her own lost connection to those parts of herself that have been wounded or repressed or split off. So unlike in the later Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone, which is built on the myth of Inanna, in that story, you have Demeter, the great Earth Mother, and her child Persephone. And Persephone is abducted by Hades, god of the underworld, and pulled into the underworld. She's kidnapped and abused and imprisoned. In the myth of Inanna, Inanna, in her courage and in her commitment to healing, hears her inner knowing, hears the call to go to the great below and reclaim what has been lost, to heal what has been ruptured. She sets forth on her journey, and she calls her companion and close friend Ninshabar to come and journey with her and stand at that threshold when she journeys into the underworld to make sure she returns again, to be her guard and companion, to hold that lifeline to ensure that this journey is one of healing and transformation and not of re-traumatization. So Ninshabar stands at that gate as Inanna journeys into the underworld. And what's profound in that journey is that it isn't what Inanna expected. She stands at the gate and says to the guardian of the underworld, I've come to see my sister who's in grief, who's in need. I've come to reconcile. She begins her descent, and at each of the 7 gates, deeper and deeper into the underworld, she loses some aspect of her identity. Her crown is taken. The symbols of her power and privilege are taken. And finally, at the final gate, even her clothing is taken. And she arrives in the antechamber where she encounters her sister naked and stripped of her power and privilege and her former identity. Now, you might think in this story, this is the moment for the joyful reunion. The sisters who have lost connection with each other reunite in joy. But no, Ereshkigal, who's been abused and banished and mistreated, is enraged. She looks at her sister with jealousy and rage and envy and stares at her with the stare of death. This is so symbolic of how, when we're caught in these dynamics of trauma, whether it's trauma in our individual lives, in our families, in our relationships, or in the collective trauma, where we see racial injustice, or the abuse of women, or of those who are different because of their gender, their sexual orientation, their religious beliefs, their economic status. There's pain, there's rage connected to those wounds, to that trauma. So Ereshkigal fixes on her sister the stare of rage, and Inanna dies. Inanna is then hung on a meat hook like a worthless corpse. Then the story goes into Ereshkigal's being both in the throes of grief and in birth pains. She's also giving birth. Ninshabar, who's waiting at that gate of the underworld, starts getting concerned. It's been 3 days, Inanna hasn't returned. So she goes to find anyone who can help, who can somehow rescue Inanna from the underworld. It's not known that someone can survive journeying into the underworld and return, but Ninshabar is intent on helping her friend. She finally comes to Enki, the god of wisdom, who knows how to move between the worlds, and she pleads with him to help Inanna. So he agrees to do that, and he sends these earth creatures that slip through the cracks of the underworld and come down to the chamber where Ereshkigal is in agony. And these little earth creatures listen to her cries of pain and her groans and her grief. And they mirror it back to her. She says, "Oh, oh, the pain of my heart." And they mirror back, "Oh, oh, the pain of your heart. Oh, I'm in agony. Oh, you're in agony." And they continue to empathically attune to her. They don't try to fix it. They don't try to change anything. These helpers come and they hear her and hold space for her and allow her to fully express her grief and pain and rage and sadness. Finally, when she's spent, she has released all the feelings that she needed to release and has felt heard and seen and held. Ereshkigal collects herself and she says to these earth creatures, "You have been so helpful to me. How can I gift you? I can give you of my grains. I can give you great bounty." They say, "No, no, no, no. All we want is that corpse over there." So the earth creatures go and they bring the bread of life and the water of life to Inanna, and they revive her. This is our story of resurrection, of death, rebirth. And they begin to help Inanna recover. And I'm sure she also was needing to be heard and seen in her shock and trauma. So they work with her, and then gradually she prepares to return to the upper world. She moves through each gate in her journey of transformation until she comes back to this realm. She's now transformed. This is not the Inanna who entered that underworld process. This is a woman who has gone through death and rebirth, is healed and transformed. You can imagine her disorientation as she comes back to the light. And this is when she emerges as a morning star. And as she emerges from the underworld, the energies of the underworld come with her. And they say no one leaves without sending someone in their place. So all of those energies are arising with her. And the spirits of the underworld see Ninshabar, who's waiting patiently for her friend to be revived and restored and to return. So the spirits of the underworld say, can we take her? Can we pull her down into the underworld? And Inanna says, no, no, no. That's my dear friend, my companion. So they journey with her as she returns to her home. And the interesting piece of this is, when we go through trauma, even as we're healing, there is that choice that we can continually make. Here's Inanna, who's been through shock, who's died and been reborn. She could deal with that with anger, seeking retribution, wanting to lash out at someone else, just as she's been hurt. But you sense that Inanna is both in this process of reintegration and now trying to reclaim the wholeness of who she is, both her own wounds from the underworld and her new understanding of her relationship with her sister. So instead of allowing those energies of the underworld to pull someone else into trauma, Inanna journeys back to her home, and then she sees her husband, Dumuzi, who interestingly enough is Mars, represents Mars, who's really taken over her power and privilege in her absence and has gotten himself very out of balance. And very calmly, quietly, Inanna says to the spirits of the underworld, take Dumuzi. He needs to spend a period of time in the underworld and go through his own transformation and healing. And then we can come back into our relationship with each other in a deeper way, in a more whole way. So Dumuzi does his journey into the underworld, and then he returns and he rejoins Inanna. Mars rejoins Venus. Mars and Venus now in balance. Mars and Venus now in deeper relationship with each other in a more conscious way. Venus is in that underworld process right now. We're feeling the stirring up of the wounds within us, the wounds between us. Venus, Inanna, is guiding us on how to heal. And we heal by voicing and expressing the pain that we've been through and having a companion or allies who hear us, who see us, who hold us in that. And how do we heal collectively as we're seeing the turbulence and the turmoil in the world because of the abuse of power, because of the imbalance? We heal through allowing that to be expressed and heard and honored for the truthfulness of the pain and the trauma. And we commit to a healing process together. I think it's profoundly significant that this underworld experience of Venus is in the horns of the bull of Taurus, in the horn close to the star Elnath. And again, in the patriarchal period, think about the meaning of the bull and the horns of the bull. We think of bullfights. We think of being in the horns of a dilemma. We think of the aggression and power of the bull in this preparation for fight. We think of the leaders in the world right now who are operating out of bullying, out of the use of aggression and the abuse of power. We think of the bull as representing that power of violence, of destruction, of power over. The interesting thing, if we reclaim the more ancient wisdom of the sacred feminine to bring it into balance with the sacred masculine, the more ancient understanding of the bull before the historical period, coming out of the age of Taurus, the bull was honored as sacred. The bull and the cows with their horns were seen as symbolic of the great, loving mother goddess. One of our most ancient images of that is in ancient Egypt, the goddess Hathor, goddess of love and nurturance and beauty and joy. And in the images that we see of her and the ancient images of the sacred bull or cow with the horns were not symbolic of weapons or destruction or aggressive power. The horns were symbolic of the crescent moon, with the orb symbolic of the sun, showing us that importance of integrating the energy of the masculine and the feminine, of the sun and the moon. This is what Venus is guiding us to now. How do we remember that more sacred feminine understanding of the horns and of the bull, and reunite it with that gift of the sacred masculine, which is the understanding of holding our power with strength and courage and consciousness? Then we come back into balance and harmony. Then we come back into wholeness within ourselves. And then we can be in healing relationship with each other and come back into right harmony with each other and with the earth. An incredible guide for us in how to do that collectively was the work of Desmond Tutu and others, encouraged by Nelson Mandela when he was leading South Africa. And they set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for healing the racial wounds that had been so prevalent in South Africa. They understood that healing will only come through reclaiming wholeness. Healing could only come through honoring and naming the truth of what had happened. So they set up this commission that was about telling the stories of the trauma experiences. Those who had been abusive, who had abused their power and been involved in racial injustice, were offered the possibility of amnesty if they confessed what they had done and showed contrition and a commitment to healing. And those who had been hurt and victimized were given space to tell their stories, to express their pain, and to hear a commitment from those who had abused them to change and to heal. Here is what Desmond Tutu said about that whole process. He talks about healing will only come through facing the truth, speaking the truth, expressing the pain to regain wholeness in relationships. And this is what he says. That is something we need in this world. A world that is polarized, a world that is fragmented, a world that destroys people. It is also something that we need in our families and our friendships. For retribution wounds and divides us from one another. Only restoration can heal us and make us whole. This is a time, as we're in this profound time of transition, it is time for us to heal, speak the truth of our own wounds, express our feelings, be heard and seen and held, and heal and reclaim our wholeness. And it is a crucial time for us to set up commissions for truth and reconciliation around the world, to honor the wounds of injustice, to honor the wounds that we've done to each other and done to the earth, to name it, to see it and face it, express what we need to express, to move into reconciliation and healing and wholeness with each other, and to come back into right relationship with the earth. May Venus guide us in how to remember our hearts and our courage in facing the truth, in feeling all that we feel, in facing each other and the wounding between us, and not seeking retribution, not getting caught in reactivity or rage or lashing out, but hearing each other, being there with and for each other to face the wounds and the pain and the anger and heal. It is time for us all to heal and come back into wholeness. Blessed be.